Hello and welcome to A Deadly Silence. I'm your host, Larry Curtis, and it is the goal of all of us associated with our program to bring you current and educational information surrounding the alcohol and drug epidemics, not only throughout the city of Brockton, but throughout all of our South Shore communities here in the Commonwealth. Our guest today is John McGahan. John is president and CEO of the Gavin Foundation. And in addition to his responsibilities at the Gavin Foundation, he is chairman of the Board of Action for Boston and Community Development, vice president of the Massachusetts Recovery Home Collaborative, a member of the South Boston Association for Nonprofits and the South Boston Hope and Recovery Coalition. John is a licensed alcohol and drug counselor and a certified addiction and domestic violence counselor. John, welcome to our program.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Pleasure. The Gavin Foundation, in the recovery world here in Massachusetts, it's a well-known name, particularly in the metropolitan Boston area. Tell us about the Gavin Foundation.
Well, I'm very proud of the organization. I took over the organization as the president about 8 years ago, and I've been able to build upon the strong foundation that was started by our founder and our predecessors. And it's called a recovery home today, the Gavin House, which is our flagship and our main program where we started. But the program was developed from originally as a halfway house. And our founder, James Gavin, was originally a correctional officer at Walpole and later became a superintendent of the Charles Street Jail in Boston, and then later a parole officer. And what he realized was that he was putting alcoholics back in jail for alcoholism for violation of parole. So he bought an abandoned police station and moved his wife and his daughters in, and that was thus the Gavin House. So his family lived on the first floor, there was some offices on the second floor and a residence on the third floor, and that was how Gavin Foundation and Gavin House started. So deeply committed.
Yeah. So in essence, those individuals who may have committed some form of low-level crime, if you would be serving a probation or a minimal jail sentence. But when they got released back into the community, there were no services available for those individuals.
Correct. He started Gavin House before the Commonwealth had a division of alcoholism, now known as the Bureau of Substance Abuse Services. So he was a real pioneer.
Fantastic. And today, the organization consists of what? Starting from that old firehouse.
So Gavin House was the police station, an abandoned police station, and that started in 1962. And from there, it now has 2 graduate houses for people that complete the program and move on to the graduate programs, which allow people to stay another 3 or 4 months into treatment. We also have the Total Immersion Program, which was a partnership that started in 1996 between the Gavin Foundation and South Boston District Court. And it was originally started for people with person-to-person violence with substance abuse. Again, what we realized is that a lot of people were ending up in the criminal justice system because of alcoholism or drug addiction. They'd spend the paycheck and go home, and a fight would start, and the police would show up, and pots and pans would be flying. And so, but if you looked at the individuals, male or female, they didn't really have other criminal justice involvement. So it was pretty obvious that if we could take the drugs and alcohol out of the equation, we could keep these families intact, keep people employed, and mend relationships, and not put people into the criminal justice system and add to the problem that addiction brings.
Now, there must have been a huge pendulum shift when we talk about domestic violence, and obviously there is a cause and effect of alcohol and drugs, as a precursor to domestic violence.
Correct.
As you mentioned, going back into the 60s and 70s, where probably law enforcement might have turned a blind eye to some of these instances, but today that can't happen.
Can't happen, from a liability perspective, from a public safety perspective. And, one thing that we're very clear that this program is for substance abuse people with the potential for violence, so it's not a pure violence program. It's for people with substance abuse. That's what we specialize in. They could have other crimes, and it might not be just domestic violence. It could be, a barroom fight. It could be resistant arrest when they're, run into a police officer in the community. And we've been very successful with that program and have since expanded it to include other courts, Dorchester Court, Somerville Court, Quincy Court. So we have been able to expand the services
throughout the metropolitan area,
Correct.
Metropolitan Boston area.
Yes,
Okay.
East Boston.
Yeah. Let's kind of step back and look at kind of the evolution of the addiction problem as we see it going forward, and that is ultimately somebody becomes addicted to an opiate, whether it's through prescribed medication or whether it's heroin on the street. Ultimately, that individual somehow reaches out for help. There's an old cliche is that nobody can help the addict but the addict themselves until they want to help. So when an addict needs help, the first part of that is the detox.
Correct.
Are those services available?
Yes. So Gavin Foundation is partnered with Phoenix House of New England, which is a national organization, and we partnered with their New England chapter. And we just recently opened up a CSS, Clinical Stabilization Unit, and we'll be opening up a detox within the next week or so. We just built it. It's 32 beds for each program, ATS and CSS. And that would be the first introduction into the treatment world. I mean, it could be, for medical reasons, that would be where they start. Many people may start in an outpatient setting as well, but if you were going to follow the continuum of care, you might say somebody might start in an ATS and then go on to a CSS program and then on to a residential program from there.
Okay. So from the detox perspective, there been recent changes in how the insurance is going to cover that. How is that going to impact?
Well, the legislation has been filed and passed and will go into effect in October that will allow...
Of 2015.
Yes, of 2015, that'll allow for a 14-day stay before a reauthorization of services kicks in, and that's going to be a huge help to the systems. It should slow down the recycling of people getting detox and then not having a next step or not having enough time and going back out and starting the process over.
So they'll get a little longer length of stay in an inpatient type of facilities and allowing them time to hopefully find,
next placement,
the next
exactly.
placement, whether it be more intensive inpatient care or outpatient.
Correct.
Outpatient type services from that perspective there. So in relationship to the Gavin Foundation, what type of inpatient services would a young adult be looking at, after a detox process?
So after the detox, they're going to get roughly, 5 to 7 days in the detox.
Yeah.
Then they're going to get the CSS days. Hopefully we'll get them up to 10 or 12, 14 CSS days. From there, they may go to a transitional support service program or onto a recovery home if there's availability. If people don't want to go into the long-term residential recovery home, then there's Gavin Foundation offers a day program or a SOAP, structured outpatient addiction program, or we would refer to other providers depending upon where people live. You want to make it accessible to them. We don't want to put any barriers between them and getting to the appointment when they leave the facility. So we've really stressed that to our case managers as part of the discharge planning. Make sure that it's easy for them to get there, that they have transportation lined up, those sort of things before we let them out of our site.
Okay. So now they're in let's say that they're now enrolled into the, you call it the CSS program?
Yes.
That's kind of a 4-6 month type of a...
Well, the CSS is where they would go after detox.
Okay.
And then from there, they could go on to a residential recovery home like Gavin House, which would be 4 to 6 months stay.
Okay, so within that 4 to 6 month stay, what type of services would be made available to that particular... is it your client? Is that how you classify it as a client?
Yeah, client or a resident.
A resident. Okay.
So the type of services that are provided inside Gavin House, as in most recovery homes, is there's three different kinds of recovery homes. There's a social model, a real recovery home, and then a TC, or a therapeutic community. Gavin House is a typical recovery home. So what would happen is when somebody comes in, they would participate in some in-house programming to get acclimated to our, so that we could see what services they really need. We could really get to know the client, and they can get acclimated to our program and our staff. And then we would look at each client individually and say, is this somebody that needs job training? Is this somebody that needs education? Is this somebody who's ready to go to work? Because everybody will enter the system with different needs. Mm-hmm. So we'll look at each resident or client and say what's best for them, work with them to set up a treatment plan, and go from there to try to achieve those goals. Mm-hmm. They would maybe work on those things during the day, whichever one of those it is, and then in the evening, the program offers individual counseling, small group counseling, phase counseling, that is set up to help them through the different stages of recovery while they're in the house. We would also ask that they participate in some form of self-help. So that could be AA, NA, GA, Smart Recovery, whatever they need, Al-Anon, because if they're dealing with other family members and going to be returning to a situation that might not be ideal, we want them to have the skills and the support within the community to be able to make a smooth transition back home.
Well, you hit the nail on the head, and when you mentioned, the family aspect of it. How important is family involvement to the addict who is in that recovery component?
Well, it's very important, and again, you want to look at each client individually on what is their situation when they come in. I mean, lots of times clients will come in and they're in a hurry to try to mend fences at home, but the people at home aren't quite so willing, so we have to put the brakes on. And then for others, it's about saying, okay, we gotta look at child support, we gotta look at these things, we gotta contact DCF and start the visit process so that some of these things are in place before you leave our program. So it's a balance with where are they when they come in, what kind of services do they need, and how much can they clinically handle or therapeutically handle at one time. There's a vast array of things that need to be done, and we want to make sure that we don't overwhelm the client at the same time.
Correct.
So it's a real balancing
while they're
act.
Dealing with their clinical recovery.
Exactly.
The emotional aspect. Insurance coverage. It's always the catch-22 of the recovery world, as there are a lot of private insurers, whether they be the state federal plans. How's that work?
Well, it's very complex. There's no ifs and buts about that. It's very complex. So if we back up to whether it's in our outpatient clinic, the Center for Recovery Services, or if it's in the CSS or the detox program, the first thing you want to do is get approval from the insurance company to treat this young man or woman, and so you got to go through the approval process. From there, it's what level of care is appropriate, and then how many days or how many sessions can you get approved, right. And then it's a constant battle to go back and try to get more if the client stays engaged in treatment and needs more services. So it's difficult to manage, and because there's so many insurance plans out there, everybody's is a little different. So it's not, as a caseworker, you can't say, well, I got to do everybody every 5 days or every 10 days or every 12 sessions. It's not like that. Each person's insurance is as individual as is their treatment plan.
Okay.
So it's complex.
Okay. We saw recently in the city of Boston under Mayor Marty Walsh that the bridge over into Long Island needed to be closed.
Yes.
And that resulted in the closure of the Long Island facilities out there for long-term recovery and aspects of that. Has there been a overflow or a reciprocal issue with your organization as a result of that?
Well, I think, I would commend the mayor's people and the providers in the Boston area and beyond for everybody stepping up and trying to engage all the clients that were in recovery programs to get them all in recovery programs. So for Gavin Foundation, one of the things we were able to do, I mentioned earlier that we have some graduate houses. So we were able to pull our graduates in and say, listen, we're not asking anybody to leave if you don't have a safe place to go, but who's got a safe place to go? And worked with them over the 24, 48 hours that this happened and got them into their housing so that we could bring people in to get them, to keep them into the recovery process. And I know many other agencies did the same. So
those residents out there at Long Island that were ultimately displaced literally overnight when that decision was made. A collective group of the agencies out there throughout the city of Boston have come together.
I would say every agency that I come in contact with, I mean, through the Recovery Homes Collaborative and others, people really said, how do we make this work? Let's get people in as fast as we can. Those that have been here a long time, if they've got a safe place to go, let's discharge them and try to give them some wraparound services so we can get people in.
You had mentioned earlier the TIPS program to deal with the criminal justice, the parole reentry program. What does the addict need to realize about those services that are available if they're coming out from a incarceration aspect?
Yeah, so if they're coming out of incarceration, Gavin Foundation actually has SACs they're called Substance Abuse Coordinators inside Region 1 and Region 2 for parole. There's 7 regions across the state.
Okay.
So that when somebody comes out on parole, they would meet with a substance abuse coordinator. If they need an evaluation, we'd get them an evaluation and then try to hook them up with services, again, within their community. So Region 1 and 2 would go anywhere from Everett, Chelsea, down through Boston, Milton, Dorchester, parts of Quincy, that sort of thing. So we would do that. In parole, in partnership with providers through the Department of Public Health, have a substance abuse coordinator in every region across the Commonwealth to try to help those people get hooked up with appropriate services. There
are some organizations, particularly in the church groups, that we see here in Brockton, in particular, that there's a move for rehabilitation versus incarceration in relationship to the cost associated to house an inmate in a house of corrections. Supportive of that initiative?
Oh, absolutely. Anything we can do to keep people, in the community, and obviously public safety's got to be a part of this.
Right,
you want to help the individual, but at the same time, you can't put public safety
absolutely
at risk. With public safety in mind, absolutely, we want to keep people in the community. We want to get them in jobs programs. We want to get them in counseling. We want to get them in, at least temporary housing or long-term housing where they're looking for the solution on that, and keep them engaged, and try to keep them moving forward. That's key. Gavin Foundation, with the Department of Public Health and SAMHSA, has a program called Access to Recovery. It's to help people coming out of incarceration or people involved in drug courts. It's a voucher program. So, for an example, if somebody has their glasses, they don't have any glasses. Well, how are you going to fill out a job application and go online and fill out a job application if you can't see it? So we could give a voucher to an optometrist and help them get glasses. There's the Access to Recovery has a whole host of training programs, from community serving works to building pathways to the Jewish Vocational Center to Project Place, a whole host of job training programs for people in drug courts, veterans court, and people coming out of incarceration to try to get them some skills to keep them moving in their recovery, moving in the right direction in their recovery.
You mentioned drug courts. I know that there have been several drug court programs within the Commonwealth, and most recently this past year, this current year, Brockton will be incorporating a drug court down here as well. What's been your experience with the success or the process of that?
So, Gavin Foundation, we actually in partnership with DPH and Sampson UMass Medical Center, have a program in Quincy Court and Dedham Veterans Court called the Mission Model. And it's a clinical and case management model combined to work with drug court clients. Gavin Foundation has been working with drug court clients going back to the early 90s with Judge Simeon. Look, it's another tool for public safety and to keep people in the community. I mean, if you just lock them up for 6 months and bring them out, I'm not saying that it doesn't help at all, but I mean, they don't have any more skills, and we've only made it more difficult for them to find housing, or more difficult for them to find jobs, and become more disconnected from their families. So, I mean, if we can keep them in the community and monitor them, with the drug courts and drug testing and those sort of things, and provide them the type of services that they need, I think as a society we're much better off.
Okay. Back in late February, early March of 2014, obviously Governor Deval Patrick at the time identified a public health crisis with the opioid addiction problem out there. The legislature supposedly came up with another $20 million for education, additional beds, to support the recovery aspects out there. Have you seen an actual bump in those services over the last 9 or 10 months that announcement took place?
Well, they put some services in place. So for an example, here in Brockton, I know you have Stairway to Recovery.
Right.
Peer-to-peer recovery centers. So they've expanded the number of peer-to-peer recovery centers. They have they've put out an RFP to monitor to certify sober homes, which again, is going to be a huge benefit to the system across the board, to the clients, to the programs. I mean,
and by certifying sober homes, what you're really kind of saying is that there are a number of sober homes throughout the Commonwealth that provide a litany of different services. Some may not even provide any services at all.
Well, and I think it's important. It's a real misnomer. What's a recovery home? What's a sober home? What's a halfway house? A recovery home, I mean, most people don't call them halfway houses anymore. They call them recovery homes because not everybody's coming out of jail, which is where they started from, way back. So they're recovery homes. The sober home is not licensed by the Commonwealth. Because they're not licensed, technically they shouldn't be offering any clinical services at all. Now, that doesn't mean that they couldn't provide case management out of the kindness of their heart or a part of their fee, but they can't offer any clinical services. So when and I don't want to, pick on the young people, but when you look at the young people and they're telling mom and dad, I'm going to such and such program, and it's a sober house, it's not a program. They're not allowed to be a program. So I think that that's a big distinction that we want to make. What is a sober home and what is a recovery home? And so what we want to do is, and there's many, many, many good sober homes out there, operators trying to do the right thing, trying to help people. Unfortunately, as with most things, there's a few that don't do the right thing, and they give everybody a black eye along the way. And so what the certification, National Association of Recovery Residents, what they have is a set of standards that say, this is what a house needs to do. They need to make sure that there's, fire extinguishers, smoke detectors, a whole litany of things to make sure that you don't have 10 people jammed in a, two-bedroom apartment and trying to share a shower and that sort of thing. So, and to make sure that there's a way for people to make legitimate complaints, because we want people to be in a safe environment. We don't want...
So it's not only the resident themselves who are seeking the services, but it's also the community in which that sober home may be located in.
Correct.
From that perspective as well.
Right. And, as a treatment provider, one of the things that, we worry about consistently is because there is no set of standards, there's no place for somebody to report that a house has had a new manager and things aren't what they were 6 months ago. We're very hesitant to make referrals to recovery homes. I don't want to refer somebody's son or daughter, or husband or wife, to a program and then find out that it's not a good place and have them come back and say, hey, you referred us there.
Right.
Because there's no standards. So I think that will, alleviate that for those that get certified.
Okay.
We'll know, hey, these guys
sense.
have a certain standard. We know we can make referrals to there. And if the standards drop too low, then there'll be somebody out that would take their certification and they would be removed from the list. So I think that's going to be a huge plus to the system because we'll be putting people in a position to succeed.
So we now have a client who is, or a resident who has gone through a detox, has gone through, some of the short-term inpatient, maybe even a longer-term inpatient situation. They're back out into the community. They may be back home with their family and loved ones or out on their own, continuing their recovery. What follow-up takes place in relationship to, that?
Well, and that's where, the peer-to-peer recovery centers can play a huge role, because they can provide the social support along with whatever self-help mechanism, with whatever outpatient counseling people choose to go with. So, you can't be in a meeting all the time, and you can't go to counseling every single day. At some point, you got to get out and live, but how do you
support yourself?
How do you socialize, have fun, do those things in a safe environment? And that's where the peer-to-peer recovery centers play a huge role. Whether it be from outings, community service work they can do together, sporting events, different projects that they can do. So I think that's a huge. They're a huge resource for the community.
Believe it or not, we've got about 30 seconds left here for this episode. If you had one thing to say out there to the parents and loved ones of somebody that might be dealing with an addiction issue, what would you say? Stay
the course. Stay the course. Treatment works. We don't know if it's the first time, the second time, the 20th time. Stay the course. Don't settle for less.
Relapse part of recovery?
Doesn't have to be.
Doesn't have to be, but it can be.
But it can be.
I want to thank you for taking some time to be with us this afternoon, John.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of all of us, Deadly Silence, we'll see you at our next episode.